the skin. And also this idea, as I say, of kind of networked affect, drawing on affect theory and looking at the ways in which we are kind of constantly being affected and being changed, being moved, being drawn to different actions through all of those kind of external stimuli and others, just as much as kind of internally. And as I say here, responsibility in this kind of formulation between the avatar and the gamer is therefore distributed. And so agency emerges as an ability to act within a certain context. So our embodied awareness is extended beyond the boundaries of the skin. But this isn't a new phenomenon. So this isn't something that is just typical to gaming. We can talk about different aspects of embodiment and thinking about the body schema beyond just technological or digital or gaming contexts. But those are kind of ideas that I'm drawing on. And so this really kind of begins to speak then to ontological inseparability. So Brad, whose work I draw on a lot, says posthumanism does not presume that man is the measure of all things. Posthumanism doesn't presume the separateness of any thing, let alone the alleged spatial, ontological and epistemological distinction that sets humans apart. And so it's really, as I say, about kind of disrupting those boundaries and looking at ourselves as much more entangled beings where you can't separate those different points from one another. And from my own work, you can see this kind of echoing where I say in my posthuman subject with a team, who is my avatar that you can see in these backgrounds, the fluctuation between the me and she is constant. A we, she, me, I negotiation that never quite stabilizes. And this also draws on Barad's kind of ideas of intra-action. So she says, in contrast to the usual interaction, which kind of presumes that things are separate and then they kind of come together, intra-action sort of uses the idea that our boundaries are only ever evident through our interaction with other things. So that idea of distinction of agencies is very different there. So this kind of brings me to my methods quite smoothly because, as I said, I conducted an autoethnography. So autoethnography is very much about writing about the self and writing about one's own experiences. And of course, this as Rob kind of picked up on earlier, becomes very problematic when you go, oh, well, hold on. What if we're saying the self isn't this autonomous being? What if we're saying the self isn't this singular kind of static thing and instead is very multiple? And so Bridotti says that the non-unitary subject includes this enlarged sense of interconnection between self and others by removing the obstacle of self-centered individualism. So you might say, well, isn't autoethnography self-centered individualism? And my argument is no. So I do use an autoethnography, but a posthuman autoethnography, which, as I argue, uses the I as an indication that as entangled as we are and as kind of multiple as we are, we're still embodied. And part of our entanglement is still within a humanistic practice of sense making. So we need to kind of disrupt the idea of the I. We need to disrupt that idea of kind of being a very singular, static, unaffected self. But we can kind of redefine it and reuse it. So in my field notes, you'll see that kind of shift between, am I talking about me, the avatar, is it we? And really that's the kind of negotiation and overcoming of different language kind of barriers and what they might mean for that conception as well. So as I say, I conducted this autoethnography. I played World of Warcraft for about 18 months and made field notes. And that's what we'll kind of go on to look at now. Because I sort of argue that as well as posthuman subjectivity sort of as a being, that is what we are all sort of posthuman subjects within that particular definition. Posthuman subjectivity can also be a sort of doing, and this draws on ideas of becoming. So I look here at what practices are occurring, what's going on in game that kind of allows this posthuman subjectivity to emerge. So we'll look now at some of my field notes. So the first one kind of explains the experience of empathy. A team falls from a great height and I gasp. It's completely involuntary. I am in that moment her falling, perhaps to my death. It's a ridiculous concept because even if a team were to die, I would be fine. And it would take just moments to run my spirit through the graveyard to find her body and resurrect. Note the her complications. The boundaries are blurred. She is not me, but she is not me. Just as Debut notes, as actors create characters who they both are and are not, it is both me and not me at the same time. And as I say, empathy is one of the kind of analytics that I use to explore how this sense of posthuman subjectivity, how that kind of experience of entanglement emerges. And you can see here that there are both kind of affective and embodied aspects of empathy, the visceral reactions that are kind of mirroring between the avatar body and the gamer body. But also that is kind of narratively situated. So it's about that understanding of the potential of death or of harm, of what that falling means or does. So there's both, the empathy is cognitive and visceral. And of course, you can't separate our embodied experience from our affective sense-making practices. But this kind of demonstrates one aspect of how empathy is experienced that, as I say, sort of captures this blurring of boundaries. A long field note, please feel free to look away from the screen as I read it. It's interesting how the interpretation of the agency of the avatar is perceived in terms of their characteristics and the ways in which, as a player, you can either contradict this with your actions or you can work with it. And thinking of the ways in which I view things as being appropriate or not to a team. On the one hand, that could be considered as my agency overpowering that of the avatar, but I don't experience it that way or feel that to be the case. Rather, I would suggest that the game narrative and game environment have a gentle effect upon my experience, which guide me towards particular decisions and choices and away from others. This is in keeping with not considering agency to be a possessed quality, but rather as a series of intra-acting, intradependent notions, allowing for the emergence of this subjectivity. So the production of the game, the environment and sounds and aesthetic of where Blood Elves start their World of Warcraft journey, and Blood Elf is my avatar's race, along with the narrative of the game, which tells a complementary story to this, as well as a team and ourselves, have all stayed with me and almost unconsciously guide my opinion of a team being quite at one with nature. This is reflected in my own choices, for example, clothing a team in browns and greens and greys, organic colours, but under closer inspection, I cannot claim that these are my agentic choices. Instead, I've been influenced by all of the other interacting components. One thing to point out here is you can see that my field notes kind of shift a lot between the previous one that was, as I could say, kind of quite visceral and exploratory of a particular moment to something that's maybe more a kind of inner dialogue, I suppose, of me working through different theoretical concepts. And what I was exploring in this case was the idea of how we make choices, I suppose. And I looked at this in comparison to in performance. You know, we often might say that an actor is more in charge of their character, that it's, you know, it's the actor's role, it's the actor's performance. And I was kind of looking at some similarities between acting and gaming, and sort of used this to argue that actually the actor isn't that much in control of the character because they're being guided by so much external work. And you can see how really here these decisions that I'm making about a team, I'm really much more pointing out that they are led and guided by the narrative of the story, by the kind of background, the world that's being created. And so I can't say I'm in control of those choices about how a team is represented, because it's not fully, you know, me making those decisions autonomously. Those decisions are guided by all of the kind of cultural signifiers about the world, aside from, you know, before I'm even in it. Another field note moves to different ideas of kind of challenge and motivation. At some indefinable point, things change. All of a sudden, I am completely committed to gaining a deeper sense of immersion. And of course, we know how problematic that term is, and I problematize that myself. And understanding of this culture. Already, the desire to level up is within me, and I am encouraged to hear from a guild member that once you reach level 15, level 30 is just around the corner. Level 15 means I can choose my specialization, and I select Beast Mastery, which means I can tame creatures. At level 20, I choose a talent and learn to ride a hawk strider. I'm eager to reach level 30 so that I can wear male armor. I approach people in game and use the chat to appeal to other players for help in quests. Now, I draw on this field note to demonstrate that as post-human as I believe we are, and in game as post-human as this subjectivity is that emerges, we're still very much led by certain neoliberal and kind of meritocratic ways of still striving for the best self that we can be. And so it's important to kind of look at the tensions there to explore how we can be post-human, but we're still very entangled in a neoliberal and kind of capitalist consumerist worldview. And so our subjectivities don't just kind of imbue the kind of good parts or the positive parts. They're a very complex matrix of different experiences and ideologies. But of course, I wanted to end on a final field note that also expresses the frustration of that. Log back in and cannot believe that I'm back at the start of this stupid dungeon with none of the objectives completed. Last time I logged out before I find the exit, and so I have to do it all again. And this is a series of field notes that goes on over several days where I'm just getting more and more annoyed by the game. And again, it's important for me to include this kind of work to explore how frustration and boredom, as well as things like empathy and performance and motivation, are really entangled within our subjectivities to create this overall view of how our entanglements are just as complex and just as kind of guided by those kind of external ideas and even the problematic ones. So really what I'm trying to do here is problematize traditionally humanist concepts. So where empathy might traditionally focus on a very distinct separation between self and other, really problematizing that and viewing that in a post-human way. And same with acting, saying that the actor isn't in control, and with motivation and boredom and frustration, all of those things, looking at those through a more post-human lens, exploring how this agency is distributed, how embodiment and networked effect kind of operate through these means, and considering what games can kind of do and sort of teach us about other contexts and non-human to human relationships. Thank you very much for listening, and please do find and follow me on Twitter if you're interested, or visit my website, and I'll just put my references up there so that you can kind of have a quick glance. And of course, I'm happy to share all of those in the chat. Thank you very much.